Hey guys, now we are in part 2 of data in healthcare delivery research and quality improvement. So we will review a bit and proceed with putting it all together. This week's module is about what do we mean by measures, how do we evaluate measures, and how do we select and develop our own measures. So in the literature, in your research questions, in a lot of the frameworks that we are familiar with and that we are being introduced to, we see terms like quality, safety, timeliness, even the word outcome every day. But it's very easy to use them, but often it's very hard to say, well, what does that mean? What does that apply to? How many qualities? How many safeties, right? And so it's really important to really turn those concepts into something that we can decide, okay, are we on track? Is there more? Is there not enough? Are we over, under? What does this all mean? So when we think about these things, it's important to identify those concepts and identify what are called indicators, or I say variables. You've also heard factors. It doesn't matter what word you use as long as you define what you mean within your work. So whatever term that you use, the best way to make sure that you are not misunderstood is to demonstrate an example. So at the end of the day, you're not going to be tasked with using the specific word, especially in management. A lot of things, a lot of terms get conflated. So if you've ever spent any amount of time with me, you'll know that I stress the importance of definitions. You can use any word you want as long as you define it for the context of your work. So it's very important that you do that. So for us, we're going to use indicators or variables to relate to those concepts that we use very broadly. Think of it as an umbrella term, right? So when we think about structures, for example, specifically, some examples could be Joint Commission accreditation. That's a very specific structural indicator. Another one is physician full-time employment units. So for example, how many full-time accredited ready-to-roll physicians do you have at your hospital? And that can be measured in hours, right? So 40 hours per week, things like that. Bed size, we've already identified in lab last week. Geography, so is the hospital in an urban or rural location? Or you can use, and here's another thing that we're about to get into is, are you going to use urban or rural location? Are you going to use the latitude and longitude coordinates? Are you using the hospital's address? There are many ways within even those indicators that you can relate to each concept. So just to give you a few examples, I've listed some structure, process, and outcome indicators. And then when we really get into the nitty-gritty, we want to operationalize those. So just as I mentioned geography, Joint Commission accreditation, it could be year accredited. I could have said that this is a variable that's going to be the year of accreditation, the year of Joint Commission accreditation. But instead I've decided that I'm going to operationalize it as yes, no. I don't care what year you were accredited. I just care that you were accredited. The use of a diagnostic test. I didn't even say what diagnostic test. Obviously that matters. So you probably would never use this, but it'd say never, sometimes, often. Usually a Likert scale. This is a Likert scale. It's adapted. Would have 5 levels, but it doesn't matter. Another one is time to treatment. So timeliness of care is one of the key determinants of a high quality healthcare delivery system. And it could be days, right? So you would determine these limits again from the literature. And all of these limits, actually, you would know if that Joint Commission accreditation matters from the literature, for example. And how we know to determine what types of data, and this will be a review from epidemiology, is by thinking about it in terms of the data, how it's scaled. It's not so important in terms of the quantitative and qualitative, but it does begin to matter in terms of who your audience is, your underlying assumptions, and also how you're going to analyze it at the end of the day. But most importantly, it's just how you conceptualize it. Not all numbers, when you have a lot of, if you would say categories, make it continuous, for example. So Likert scales, for example, are ordinal, even though we end up giving a score when we take a Likert scale and we think that that's continuous. It's not, it's ordinal. What does that mean? That you don't use the average and the mean, you use the median. This is a huge issue. You have nominal scales, for example, that it doesn't matter one level to the next. So there's no meaning between each one. Ordinal scales does describe an order, for example, first, second, third. Intervals, there's a certain amount of meaning between each space, between each number. So things like time. Ratio are things like that can double. So for example, count data is considered a ratio variable and to a certain extent continuous, okay? And so when we think about that, then we think about, okay, well then how can we measure this data and how can we visualize this data? So I did give you a little easy kind of reference, much like in the last module, I gave you the reference for the study goals and the study types. So you'll have seen that table. If it's exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory, then you know what study types go under which one. Again, this is not set in stone and neither is that one, but this is just a good reference for when you're not sure which way, in which direction to go. So for example, they all require, you can do frequencies with all of them except for ratio or continuous variables because those require a mean and a distribution, right? Because these are the only ones that assume a normal distribution. Everything else is a non-normal distribution because they're considered to some extent categorical of some kind. And then I call this other nuggets because these are just some rules of thumb that I don't want you to forget, but more likely you'll use these as references. So length of stay in clinic visits are counts. And then this is what you would use for analysis. We'll get to that later in the semester, but I wanted to make sure that you have that. But essentially, when you think about these there's no negative numbers. Blood pressure can't be negative, for example, and neither can your weight. Ordinal data are not continuous. The other thing is that there's basically two kinds of data, two kinds of measures. So there's going to be observed and self-reported. And this is something that you have to take into consideration when you are picking the data as we review it. So observed are things like your EHR data and clinical measures. So things that you can sort of take from somebody or validate. So you can take a blood pressure, you can take a blood sample, you can confirm a clinic visit in EHR data. Self-reported data are subject to their own, and that's where we talk about threats to validity because they are self-reported, so they come with their own limitations. Either way, the most important thing about measures and indicators is that they have to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So what that means is that you can't overlap, you can't count people twice, and you have to count everybody that you're counting. So whatever you ask, you have to make sure that you are including everybody. So if you recall the targets, it can't be that, oh, we didn't think about asking those people, or we only included this group but not that group. It has to be that you have considered everybody that's potentially askable within that target, and that they are mutually exclusive so that everybody fits in their own bucket. Otherwise, you're going to have overlap, bias, and then you can also double count people, which is going to bias your sample and your estimates, which would be type 1 or 2 errors. So moving into measurement, there's two types of measurement error. There's systematic and non-systematic random error. And non-systematic random error, we typically account for in our analyses. So that's actually not as bad as the systematic error, which is what you can prevent. So again, that's not exhaustive, mutually exclusive questions. So if you are making your own questions, this is something you really have to watch out for, which is why I always suggest that if you are tasked with making a survey, that you actually utilize existing validated surveys, which we're going to review, because there's many excellent surveys that cover many questions that your hospital or clinic will have for any quality improvement initiative that are likely very helpful or useful that you can adapt. And this can also have to do with, for example, not using enough questions. So maybe you asked one question that you intended to cover your entire research question, and it turns out that you really needed to ask several questions so that it didn't really get to it, because you realize, you know what, we really should ask more about this area and not just one other area. The poor wording of the question. So for example, if you didn't ask the question in a fashion that might be understandable, or you had some error in terms of data collection. So you checked the wrong box, things like that. All of these can be addressed by pilot testing everything that you do. So always, even if you're in a pinch, you're in a rush, there is always time to pilot test. Even if it's a convenient sample, like everyone in your office, test it. You will never regret it. Because what happens is, A, you increase errors, you can increase uncertainty and bias, and you can reduce every validity possible, including the reliability. And this is very dangerous because your hospital may run with those results anyway. And that is a big issue, especially if this is an impactful policy related or strategy. So for your strategic plan related activities. So you really, really, really want to put that extra time. Or again, that's why it's so helpful to use existing surveys. The other great thing about existing surveys is then you can also analyze the data from the existing survey and compare your findings to a much larger data set so that you can see, that gives you kind of a baseline to compare to. When you do have surveys and when you do have measures, if you do decide to make the measures, there's two things that you want to think about, measure validity and measure reliability. So validity is when you're actually making brand new measures to make a diagnostic scale, for example. So this is more specific to diagnosing an illness, things like that. So I won't go too much into that. But essentially, the most important thing for you are the first two, face validity, actually the first three, face validity, construct validity, and content validity. So the face validity is, does it look like an appropriate question that's related to your research question? So if the question's asking about manufacturing and you're asking about patient satisfaction, then it probably doesn't have face validity for you. So you're gonna have to move on. Now, if the construct validity, which is about satisfaction, is similar, then that might be something worth considering. And then if the content is about satisfaction within a certain process of care, that's another area that you want to see, okay, this is valid in these two domains. The other aspect is reliability. So reliability is, again, are you going to be able to ask the same questions in the same way? Is there agreement with the way that the question is measured? Is it measuring the same thing over and over again, right? So is it measuring the right thing, validity, and is it measuring it correctly? So that's test, retest, reliability, right? So I'm sorry, that's reliability. One way is test, retest, reliability. So test, retest is just what it sounds like. You give a test, and then after a certain period of time, you give the test again. Now, the thing that you have to be careful about test, retest, reliability is the impact of the first test on the second test. Because if you haven't given enough time between the first and second test, there is the danger that there could be some recall of the performance of the first test. And so if I have a really good memory and I remember something, then I actually may do better on the second test. The other one is internal consistency reliability. So I test my performance on the first half based on the second half, right? So the test the first half on the second half. So I split the test in two, and I'm giving you the analytical test in the event that you have a wild hair and you want to do this, by the way. But the only problem with that is that if your test isn't long enough, if there's any differences, if there's any major differences, then you have to have a very homogeneous scale. So that one is not very popular. The most popular, because again, test, retest, reliability requires time, right? Internal consistency requires a very, very well-made scale. Inter-rater reliability just requires two people. I use inter-rater reliability a lot. And basically it's sort of a measure of agreement between double data entry, if you will. So it's very popular, and it's the proportion of agreement And you've also probably heard of interclass correlation coefficients. And finally, it's the kappa score. So if you have, for example, two radiologists reading a chest x-ray, and it's the proportion of yes and no of one to the proportion of yes and no of the other, and how many yeses and how many nos. It's like a 2x2, where, agreement versus disagreement. So yes, yes, no, no, yes, no, no, yes. And this is actually a very helpful measure in terms of reliability. And so you use this with responses to your measures that you create to see if the questions that you're asking are actually answering what you want the answers to be. And they're answering about the constructs and themes that you're interested in. But overall, the best way to ask good questions is to find good questions. So use established measures. And as you notice, I'm using measures and questions interchangeably to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So consider those. The other thing to do is make sure that you are training the people and making sure that everybody's doing the same thing the same way. So that's why it's important to do introductions, train your people, create a script, make sure that everyone's asking questions the same way, and that you take into account, again, the population, the research question, who you're thinking about, the underlying assumptions. I know I say that all the time, but you have to think about the context, right? So underlying assumptions have to do with who it is, where they are, what you're asking about, and does it apply to what you want to know? And do your assumptions match the context in which you're asking and who you're asking it of? So if what you're asking about really was asked about for a very specific population, and now you're trying to ask it of a very different population, is that going to work? Did you really think about that, or did you put no time into the adaptation? So make sure that you take that into account. So let's say you want to develop and your own measures. Well, remember, good measures are exhaustive, they're mutually exclusive, right? So they make sure they cover everybody. So I'm not just going to ask questions for women, but no men. They're mutually exclusive. So only women with brown hair, but not blonde hair. They're easy to read. They're short or relatively short. They're not leading, and they're related to your research question. So there's two kinds of questions. They're open-ended and they're close-ended. So if you do any kind of data mining or EHR analysis, they're unstructured or structured. So same question, open-ended, close-ended. And then some more, now the rest of these are for closed questions. So some more specific types. This is called a contingency question. So this is basically if you add a skip pattern. So you say, do you have a dog? If yes, go to the next question. If not, go to the end of the survey. And this is very helpful so that you don't have to write 10 different surveys for 10 different kinds of conditions. A two-way question. This way you are doing what? You're making it mutually exclusive, but also exhaustive, right? So you're including everybody, but you're making sure everybody has a bucket. Multiple choice. So there's two kinds of multiple choice. So if you notice, the first one is single option, and the next one is select all that apply. The way that you code these when they become a data dictionary, and we'll talk about that as we review data dictionaries in lab, is the single option becomes a categorical variable, right? So you can only pick one, you force them into a single option, whereas the multiple choice becomes a lot of dichotomous questions, a lot of two-way questions, right? Because you can't code a select all that apply like a categorical question. And I'll show you more about that in lab. Then some other options you have with the select all that apply multiple choice is that you can ask them, instead of saying just select all that apply, you can say, no, don't select all that apply. Looking at all of these, I want you to rank them. Rank them from most favorite to least favorite. Or instead of ranking them, tell me how many hours a week do you spend on Twitter? How many hours a week do you spend on Facebook? Or you can tell them, how many hours per day do you spend on Twitter? How many hours per day or minutes per day, or whatever you want. But there's a lot that you can do with the select all that apply. And again, they become several dichotomous, and I'll show you how you do that with your code book, much like we did for the American Hospital Association. And then lastly, and this is a big one in terms of perception. So you see this a lot in quality improvement studies, patient satisfaction, patient experience. So the HCAHPS and the CAHPS surveys, which all of you will get to know and love, it has Likert or Likert type questions. And that is strongly agree, agree, undecided, disagree, strongly disagree, or some variation therein. And you'll see that this has 5. Likert scales can also have 7 and up to 10 options. Another one is excellent, good, average, fair, poor, and you'll see don't know, refuse, not applicable. So there's a lot of different Likert type, and that is an ordinal scale because it goes, there is definitely an order to it and it matters. And if you notice, it's a U-shaped order, right? So you pick one, and that's the Likert type scale, and so it does have a different type of analysis. But like I said, there's a lot of argument in terms of the analysis plan for that one, which we can chat about and argue about later. So what to avoid, and this is the kiss of death, which is why again I urge you to not write your own questions, or if you do, become very, very cognizant of this. And that's why short questions are your best friend. Loaded questions. So this is an actual example I pulled from the media, is to mix a general and specific statement. So if you do this, stop yourself. So that's why you also review and you pilot test. What do you have to say to people that are afraid, right? So this is already saying, you know what? We already know exactly what's going to happen here, right? This is suggestive, and it's not really. They could have just said, "What do you have to say to people?" A leading question. So, for example, would you agree? So that's already indicating to the person that if you disagree, you're already going against what I want. And most people, when they're asked questions, especially if they're a stranger, like someone you're trying to survey, people want to agree. That's called satisficing. And so they're going to agree with you, which is going to bias your results. So that leads to the whole validity and reliability issue, right? Double-barreled questions. So it could be 2 negatives, 2 positive, a negative, and a positive. So be very careful. That is so common. We do that so much. And just a few other thoughts. So a rule of thumb, not set in stone, is to keep questions less than 20 words. They say to use 2 to 3 syllable words, thinking about health literacy. There is the Fleisch-Kincaid health literacy scale. It's free online, and you can actually plug your questions into it to assess the health literacy. It's best to stay at a 5th or 6th grade reading level for a widely disseminated survey. Think about the order of the questions. So you don't want to ask deeply personal questions and then after ask about feelings of happiness, or deeply, invasive questions and then ask about trust or something like that. Think about health literacy, culture, language, environment, context, all of these assumptions that I've talked about. These assumptions are the basis of equity, because when you think about a person's context, you're thinking about their lived experiences and the impact of your efforts, not just on your goals, but also on the context of your desired goal. And that's it. Thank you so much.